Hello, everyone, and welcome to Writers Drinking Coffee. This is a podcast where writers sit around drinking tasty beverages to talk about writing, publishing, and the whole creative process. There will be rants and raves and opinions that may not agree but are lovingly delivered. We do not censor ourselves, so consider us PG-13. Today, your hosts are John Schmidt and me, Jeannie Warner. This is episode 205, Interview with Anne Montgomery. Welcome, Anne.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm glad to be here.
I am so delighted. I got a little bit too jazzed at first when the publicist sent me information about you because the first thing that jumped out at the page is you know how to ice skate and you have been an ice hockey official.
I was a very long time ago, but you and I spoke before the show and you told me you played hockey, and I am so jealous because when I was in school, it was before Title IX. They didn't let girls play hockey. That would have been the coolest thing ever.
Oh.
So instead I was an ice dancer and I had no skills, but I tried. And then when I sort of accidentally fell into officiating, ice hockey was the first opportunity I had. So yeah, I did ice hockey for 5 years before I branched out into basketball, football, soccer, and what am I forget? Baseball.
I believe it. They're always short of officials. And I was at CU Boulder, Colorado, when there was the first girl that was suing the university to be allowed to go out for the team. Because what? Girls playing sports with boys? And it's still kind of alien in some places, but...
Oh, I know. And it's so, but see now, even I moved to Arizona when I stopped officiating hockey because they didn't have any ice out there at that point. But now they've got girls' leagues and it's very common, and I'm so delighted. I'm pushing 70, so I'm probably not putting on my hockey skates.
Oh, I don't know. We're a kind of an educational league, the Northern California Women's Hockey League organization, and the oldest one for a while was 73, who played in the green, which is the basic beginning learning. And I'm like, Sue, you could be at a higher level. And she's like, I play it because I love the game. And I don't want to get too competitive, she said, because I'm 73. So
yeah, I've had to move on to things where I don't fall down.
I understand completely.
The only sport that doesn't hurt me at this point is scuba diving because I can't fall. So that worked. After 20 years on figure skates and being a football official, I broke my back, I broke my leg twice, I had rotator cuff surgery twice. And so at this point, I think scuba diving is probably the only thing I'm going to keep doing.
Well, I hear you, but I have no grace. So I looked at Sarah Hughes landing all of those triples at the Olympics, and I thought I could never be that. I couldn't see myself. But when I saw a Canadian girl elbow Monique Lamoureux in the head, and her sister immediately jumped that girl and started rolling around on the ice with him, like, I feel like I could do that. That was
I would have loved hockey, much better than ice dancing. Absolutely. But, I'm just glad girls get to play now.
Well, girls get to do play and officiate and write books. Do I understand this is your 6th published novel?
Yes, it is. Your Forgotten Sons, which came out June 6th of this year, which was the 80th anniversary of D-Day, is my 6th published novel.
Wow, that's kind of impressive. And do you have books written that you never really got published too?
Oh, of course. Many writers do. I have them in little digital cabinets that will probably never come out. But writing is like sports, because the first time you played hockey, were you great?
Oh, dear Lord.
Yeah, exactly. The first time somebody picks up a tennis racket or a baseball, they're not great. They have to practice, practice, practice. It's exactly the same with writing. My most recent book is a lot better than my first book because you learn along the way. So yeah, I think the other 3 will remain in a drawer.
Does it get easier to write, or does it actually get harder because now you know what you don't know and what needs improvement?
First of all, I started writing when I became a sportscaster. And, a lot of young people don't understand because I taught this and they're like, well, you just need to know games. I'm like, no, you need to know how to tell a story. When you do sports on television, you write your own scripts, you do your own highlights for the most part. And so you have to be able to tell a story. So on any given day, I was telling dozens of stories. And then when I was pushing 40 and I was not considered pretty enough to be in front of a camera anymore, I moved into print reporting. And so I had more space. I could use more words to tell a story. So moving into writing novels was just longer stories.
That makes complete sense because you taught journalism, right?
well, in my big life change moment, I went back to school at 42 and got a teaching certification, did get my master's degree, and I ended up teaching for 20 years in a Title I school. Now, Title I school is where at least 75% of the student population lives in poverty. And I was kind of a spoiled brat kid. I grew up in, a middle-class family. Both my parents went to college. And here I was suddenly faced with these kids who had absolutely horrendous home lives, addiction and drugs and gangs and teen pregnancy and weapons. And it was an everyday battle. And it taught me a lot about what was important. And I realized feeling sorry for myself because I wasn't on TV was definitely not important in the grand scheme of things. So, and now I have forgotten your question.
No, it was just the general topic of teaching, and journalism is telling stories, and sportscasting is telling stories. So you have been a teacher of storytellers at many different
Yes,
levels and ways.
yes. I taught communication skills, which I taught the most dreaded of skills, public speaking, which I just looked that up. 25% of Americans would rather not have to public speak. They'd rather face drowning, snakes and bugs and claustrophobia instead of public speaking. So yeah, I made kids get up in front of a class and speak, and I'm not sure how they probably hated me. They might still hate me. But I also taught them how to write a news story and how to be part of an interview. And so a lot of communication skills. I taught briefly at the college level at Arizona State University. I taught sports reporting, but one of the kids rated me at the end of the year. He goes, the next time Arizona State hires someone to teach sports reporting, it should be someone younger.
Oh,
nice.
How sharper than a serpent's tooth.
I'm like, okay, all right. Now, I wanted to point out that when I was at ESPN, I worked with Chris Berman, and Chris is 2 months younger than I am. And I'm guessing if Chris Berman wandered into that classroom and was going to teach them about sports reporting, they'd be all over it. So I'm guessing it wasn't just an age thing.
I don't know. There could be a lot of age, and there's definitely sexism in almost everything that I've found that we do.
Certainly sports reporting and officiating both.
So how did you come? I mean, when we look, John you were talking about some other books. We talked about you before we ever even met you.
Uh-oh.
So you have 6 published novels, but when I went to my local library site on Hoopla, they served up around 40 little science books.
Those are not mine. That's an Amazon quirk. I don't know why I got tangled into that, but it's really hard to straighten those things out. So no, I write novels. I have 6 published novels, and my Amazon page, my Goodreads page, my website, it just lists those 6. And the ironic part for a lot of people is I don't write about sports ever.
I actually was going to ask about that.
Because we're looking at the books, and I'm like, well, maybe there's sport. I mean, there's a baseball game at the very least, and your Forgotten Sons.
Yes, and there's a basketball game in A Light in the Desert.
Okay.
Just a quick little kid talking about watching the Suns and the Lakers on TV. I used to cover the Suns, and that was fun. But the bottom line is I don't write about sports. They were my life for so long. I became an official because I wanted to be a sportscaster. And in the 1980s, early 1980s, nobody was going to hire a woman sportscaster. They just weren't. And one day I realized I didn't know, and I knew hockey, but I didn't know any other sport really that well because, as I said, before Title IX, they didn't let me play. So I decided to become an amateur official in the 5 main team spectator sports, which I mentioned: football, baseball, ice hockey, soccer, and basketball. And I believed some forward-thinking news director would hire me as a sportscaster with those credentials. And in fact, that is exactly what happened. I went on to work for 5 TV stations.
I want to say, pay attention to this out there.
Yeah, I never quit officiating.
I wanted to pause out there and say, hey, so when you're wondering about your life and your future and you want to be involved in sports and things, this is the clever thinking that we talk about, people.
Yeah, this is being involved in sports.
It was just sort of an accident. But ironic thing to me is I didn't quit officiating till 2019. I officiated for 40 years.
I'm sorry, planning to become an official so you learn each sport so you can be hired as a sportscaster does not sound like an accident. The idea may have come to you accidentally, but it sounds like a well-executed plan. Twirl mustache.
Well, I was in Washington, D.C. I was working in a bar in Georgetown, having a great time in the early 80s. Oh, my goodness, it was so much fun. My parents kept saying, don't you want a real job? And I'm like, well, I don't know. It was fun. But I went to see the Washington Capitals play one night with my aunt, who was more like a sister, and she had a date. And the guy was bemoaning the fact that there just weren't enough amateur officials for kids hockey. And my aunt said, oh, Annie can skate. And he said, hey, you want to be a referee? And I said, all right, why not? And so I took the test, I went to the class, and they scheduled me for some 6 a.m. 5-year-old hockey game. And the weird part is I should have known better, but I had never had hockey skates on.
Oh,
I grew up on figure skates. And so here are my brand new hockey skates. I'm lacing them up. I got my stripes on and my whistle, and I'm ready to go. And I get out on the ice to take that face off with those 5-year-olds, and I crashed on the ice because what didn't I have?
you did not have a toe pick and your
Yes.
skates were curved up and back.
No toe picks. And I'm a lazy skater, so I'm flat on the ice. I go, crap, and dig my skate into the ice like I had done for years, and I fell again.
Yeah.
And I've got these little kids in their little jerseys down to their ankles and their sawed-off sticks, and their helmets are all too big, so they're kind of sideways, and they're staring at me. Finally got up. I finally took the face off. I don't remember the rest of the game, but I do remember the ride home when I realized that I had to learn all the rules. I had to understand how the game is played. I had to go out there and be part of it. And that was the moment I decided to do the other 4 sports, because I went, no one is even letting me be interviewed for a job. I mean, face it, back then, there were no women's sports. It was like 1979.
I hear you. I actually worked with a gal that became a sportscaster later. Well, I think she's younger than you, but still, it is an interesting challenge for women. But I think the doors are more open than they used to be. And Leah Hextall, it was a play-by-play caller, and we're all very proud.
Well, that's really rare, because unfortunately, when people ask me if things have gotten better, I don't think they've gotten all that much better. Because what do they have women do? They're sideline reporters, which is the worst job in sportscasting, because it's thankless. They either ask coaches questions, oh, coach, you're down by 50 points at halftime. How do you feel? Well, geez, who wants to ask that question? Or it's all medical. I think they should have nurses on the sidelines in scrubs, and they should say, oh, Bob, did he hurt his knee? Yeah, I think it's his ACL. I mean, it's a stupid job, but they have it so they can say they hire women. Why can't women be in the booth? Why can't women do color and play-by-play?
Well, like I was saying, there's a couple that are color and a couple that are play-by-play, and the Kraken just hired a woman on the bench, and I'm very proud. But
yes, women are breaking into coaching, but it's still slow.
I wanted to wrap that into a little bit of when you wrote about your forgotten sons. And I want to say that you took me down some of the most interesting rat holes. That I come from a military family and military officers on all sides. And there are branches of the Army that I did not know existed before your book, which is great. So everyone run out and buy your Forgotten Sons. But let's talk a little bit about saying that mortuary affairs. And
during World War II, mortuary affairs became after World War II.
Right.
But during World War II, it was called the Graves Registration Service.
Yeah.
And what that was, and it's so amazing to me that people don't even think about it, is that after you shoot a plane out of the sky, or you have a giant battle like D-Day, when 10,000 were dead on both the Allied and German sides, somebody has to pick up the pieces. Somebody has to get the bodies, locate them, identify them, and bury them. And that's what Bud Richardville, the man I wrote the book about, that was his job.
So it was based on a true story, then?
It is inspired by a true story. Now, there's a big difference.
Right.
Based on a true story means we know everything that happened. We know the conversations, we know their friends, we know their family, we know what the general said to the colonel. This is not that, because I did not have all the information. I know who Bud is. And sadly, like 80% of all the Army people who were discharged between 1912 and 1960, those records were destroyed in a fire in 1973 in the records depository in St. Louis. So I had no access to his records. What I did have was a packet of 75-year-old letters that Bud wrote home to his mother and his sister and his brother-in-law. And I also had the Richardville family, and they had stories about Bud. So while I know where Bud went and what he did, I don't know who his friends were in the war. I don't know day by day where he was. But I'm going to backtrack a little bit. I came upon this story because my best friend, Regina Liperato, called me one day from Georgia. I'm in Arizona. And she said, I need you to come to Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. I have to have a surgery. And it's a very dangerous surgery. And I want you to be my healthcare power of attorney. And I said, of course. And so I flew to Baltimore. And the night before her surgery, and she had a tumor wrapped around her spinal cord.
Ow.
There was a good chance she was going to wake up paralyzed from the waist down. And so she needed me there. And her husband was there, but her husband is a soldier with bad post-traumatic stress, really can't be in hospitals. And so I was the one that was there to make decisions. The night before the surgery, she comes up to me with this plastic bag, Ziploc bag full of letters. And she said, look, whatever happens to me, I want you to promise that you will tell Bud's story. Now, I'd heard her talk about her Uncle Bud over the years, and I wanted to make my friend feel better. So I said, of course, I promise. So then she had surgery. She walked out of the hospital. She's fine. But I had promised to write this book, and so I did.
That's
Wow.
amazing. There's so much you think of, like, okay, I had never thought, we see all of the, I'm just going to call it the stupid glorification of war in movies and D-Day and all of
Yes.
the others, but nobody ever thinks like, so those thousands and thousands of bodies floating in the water, did those just wash up on the beach and stay there? It's literally something like, I think I'd never thought to think of it.
And you know why? Because the novels we read and the movies we see after the battle, after people are all done shooting each other up or the ships are sunk, they just move to the next page or the next scene. Nobody ever says, well, what the hell happens now?
I liked a scene in your book you had there, like, oh, there's paratroopers hanging in trees,
Oh,
because
God. Yeah.
my grandfather was one of the airborne divisions that parachuted in 24 hours before D-Day.
Oh, the 101st.
There was more than just the 101st.
Oh, okay.
But yeah.
I don't know.
But something that is not talked about is in his battalion that dropped, I mean, his unit that dropped in, they had about 75% capture rate.
Yeah.
And so he spent most of that time, I mean, he was on the ground before D-Day, but immediately captured by Germans and spent the rest of the time in a German POW camp.
Ugh,
And if
horrible.
I had not read my mother badgered him until he told the story, I would not, because I didn't even know that. Nobody talks about the guys that parachuted in before. But when I ran across them in your book of they also dropped decoys, I burst out laughing with love and delight because
The Ruperts, those were the Brits that did that. Yeah, those little 3-foot dolls. Yeah, that was fun.
Yeah, that's a very Brit thing to say.
Yeah.
I blame Montgomery.
Yeah, well,
Always
yes.
blame Montgomery. There is a very good, it's so rare that it stands out. Louis McMaster Bujold published a story about someone doing graves registration, basically, this job, after a space battle, and that's the only other time I've encountered this.
Yeah.
In my research, I only found one book, and it was called Crosses in the Wind, and it was about Captain James Schumann, who went on to become a lieutenant colonel. And he wrote in 1947 about his 18 months as a captain in the I think he was in the 606th Graves Registration Service. And I will say that without that book, I probably couldn't have written Your Forgotten Sons, because when Bud wrote letters home, like all soldiers, he didn't really say what he was doing. They didn't want them to talk about what was happening. They wanted to say, Mom, I miss you. I miss your apple pie, house sis. But so he didn't say what he was doing. He only mentioned what he was doing to his brother-in-law.
I think you brought forward that a little bit when you had the lieutenant say to him, no, your family wants to, they don't want to hear you're miserable.
Right.
And so how that kind of informed Bud's letters that you wrote of generally trying to be happy, even though I guess it's like at home when you write to him, you don't want to say, hey, I'm so unhappy and miserable and everything sucks without
Exactly.
you. And as we both try to protect each other on both sides of any kind of spectrum,
Yeah.
there's a lot that goes unsaid, isn't there?
Yeah, and I will say, without Schumann's book, because he was very specific about the things they did. When you read about the guys going back to Normandy Beach, one of the beaches, Omaha Beach, whatever it was, a couple weeks later, and having to go out in the Higgins boat and go underwater,
Yeah.
that really happened.
That was very vivid and beautiful. And I want to say,
Yeah, it was horrible, horrible.
that could even be triggering for people that, this is your warning as a reader, that
I hate to
it is
say it.
graphically beautiful.
I love your book. I have a wide swath of friends who have dealt with death in the military who I would not recommend this book to without letting them know that this is the other side of the the heroism coin to say, this is the cleanup. This is
I
the
understand, but I would not have done it justice if I'd tried to candy coat things.
No, no. I think honestly, it would be cathartic for some of my friends to be able to read this and know that the horrible things that happened, which are kind of normal things that we just don't deal with, unfortunately normal when death is
Yeah.
there, are seen. And much like a number of discussions, frankly, around gender that are happening now that couldn't happen before, we can begin to talk about death in a more normal manner and hopefully take some of the hidden secretness of it away. Speaking of hidden secrets, I'm going to segue and ask, what is your process on writing?
Understand that Your Forgotten Sons is a little different from most of the books that I've written. Generally, I look at it like a reporter. I pick subject matter that interests me. I still read old-fashioned newspapers every day, and I still watch the news, and I see stories that fascinate me, and I think about them, and then I think about the characters that might be around that. For example, I have a book called Wild Horses on the Salt. And it's about the wild horse problem in Arizona. We have too many wild horses, too many people now moving into where they're supposed to be living. People are shooting them, they're getting run over by cars. And some people love the horses and some people hate them. And it's a problem. So I was fascinated with that story. And I realized that, let's say there was a cattle rancher, that the cattle ranchers do not like the horses because they eat the fodder that their cows are supposed to eat. So I called up a cattle rancher and I said, I'm really interested in learning about you and the wild horses and the cattle. And he said, come on over. And so I got to go and meet a cattle rancher and interview him. And he happened to be a beekeeper. And so I learned about beekeeping. And so I had a cattle rancher who was a beekeeper in the book. That part of it I love, because that's back to being a reporter.
Yeah.
So I come up with an idea. I interview possible real people that would be characters. And I go and interview them. And of course, today with the internet, you can find any information you need on the internet. And I gather all that information together and I let that wallow around in my brain. And because I was a teacher for 20 years, I only wrote books in the summer. So while I might do interview people and research during the school year, I would then write a book in the summer over 10 weeks.
Living in Arizona, the summer always seems longer, but yes.
Yes, it's
and yet you did, in a way, interview the foremost expert you could find on Graves registration by reading the Lieutenant Colonel's book. So
yes, I did. And again, I wish he was still around. I Googled him and couldn't. I'm pretty sure he's probably has died by now. But without that, I mean, you read about the city of Brest, the tunnels under the city of Brest that we bombed to dust during the war. That was all real.
Yeah.
That was all real. And honestly, I would not have had enough insight into the Graves Registration Service had I not read that. While I did know that our men did go to Dachau and many of the other death camps and sort of had a picture of what that was like, these other stories were things I never would have thought of, because I don't think the military even wants to think about it. It's like, let's move on, big brave battles, everybody shooting each other, yay, wow, we're heroes, but not the aftermath. And honestly, if you think of D-Day, there's a health issue. You can't have bodies lying around, people will get sick.
Yeah.
And then there's a morale issue. The Allies funneled 186,000 soldiers through those beaches to feed into the attack on Europe, and they couldn't have bodies lying around. What would that have done to the morale?
I thought it was interesting I learned that we changed our policy from when your book and you have Bud, and I loved the story of here's the guys that go around and say, we need to find a good place for a graveyard. And we need to find another good place for a graveyard, because it really makes you think that civil engineering applies to graveyards.
Yes, it certainly does. And when you consider that, I think we have American cemeteries in 36 countries and a couple territories. There are Americans buried all over the world that the Graves Registration Service people designed. And they're beautiful. Everybody goes to Normandy. Of course, they go to the cemetery. Bud and his men built that.
It also was interesting for me that when the policy changed that said, yeah, we're not going to bury them and then disinter them and bring them home and bury them again. So suddenly that brought up is there a follow-up novel somewhere of the person who flies piles of corpses home? Because your image of here's a foot in a boot under a cross, and that's all that was left of him, was,
Or that was found then, yeah.
yeah.
And they would, but the difference is during World War II, we did not have the capacity to bring home thousands of dead people in the middle of a war. We just didn't have it. At the end of the war, families were told that if you'd like to bring your loved one back, we'll do that. If you don't, we'll give you $10,000. I think that was the amount. Some families needed the money and said, sure. But today in a war, and I think from Vietnam on, they flow them home right away.
They did.
Because they could do that. It wasn't a world war, and they had the refrigeration plane. They had ways of doing that. So if you died, you were home by the end of the week. They couldn't do that in World War II.
I think they started that in the Korean War. My uncle flew helicopters in Vietnam. Yes, they were combat helicopters, but they also flew other things, and he doesn't talk about it beyond that. So
no, I'm sure. Yeah,
one of the fascinating changes also, and we haven't talked to him because he hasn't written a book. One of the fascinating changes is that for instance, soldiers who were buried without having graves registration, you get a report that such and such a soldier was killed and buried in such and such a place, and the family still wants the body. So you need to send out, and the U.S. government does, the armed forces do, a forensic archaeology team.
Yes.
And there is actually a black market. I can call it nothing but a black market, especially in the Pacific Islands, of people who find American burials and dig them up and sell them to people who are looking for American war dead.
Yeah.
And there's been whole drama all about that. But I really only know about that because a friend of mine was one of those forensic archaeologists, which is one of those things you don't think about.
Who thinks of a dental evidence response team?
Or
yeah, exactly. But those stories do come up periodically in the news, and I have thought about those. That's an interesting idea to write about, I think. But I can't imagine doing it. I just
Yeah, well, during World War, no, I think it was Vietnam. Was it Spiro Agnew? That was where they first stopped really even talking about military coming home, because they just started saying, instead of burying them there and making a big deal there, we'll just quietly do it and pay people off, because if people saw the mounds and mounds of bodies, they're like, we're killing off our generations here, and they would become anti-war, and that could not be done. So the politics involved with it is also darkly fascinating.
If you ask my friend Regina, who is Bud's niece, she will tell you that even today the military doesn't want to talk about this, because she was trying to get Bud repatriated, and she just ran into closed door after closed door after closed door. They don't want to talk about this part. They want to build up, like the commercials you see on the NFL games, the few, the proud, the Marines, go in there and fight. And they don't want to point out the other parts.
That's the Department of Defense. We remember when John McCain pointed out how much money the DoD spends on the NFL and all of those big patriotic displays.
I know.
And that's to keep recruitment numbers up. So yeah. But
also on video games. But
you had one other topic that I found was delightful, and I wanted to see if the idea of war brides, because young Bud gets married before he goes off to war. And I don't want to spoil anything in the book, so I'm just saying that things are not always what you seem, and I think I'd figured it out quicker than Bud did of what was going on. The term allotment Annie I didn't realize there was a whole title for it. So is there anything you wish you'd known before it all went off to the publisher on that topic? Or
the allotment Annies, and this was well known to the military. In fact, they produced public service videos like how not to get a venereal disease and how to protect yourself. There was one called How to Protect Yourself from Allotment Annies. And these were women who, for one reason or another, married soldiers for their paychecks. And they knew it was happening. And you've got young kids coming off the farm, young, naive, 17, 18 years old. And some lovely woman would approach them right before they ship out and say, oh, you're great, I'm in love with you, and have sex with them. And they thought they were in love, and it was time to get married. And in reality, these women were looking for the allotment, which was the paycheck. And the bottom line there is the women would get $20 a week. Now, today, that doesn't sound like a lot, but that's like $365 a week back then.
Yeah.
My numbers might be a little off, but that's close. And then if that soldier died, they got 10 grand. That's like $176,000, I think. So they would marry these men. And one woman actually was caught and put in prison. She married 6 sailors at the same time.
Oh, This started me looking up the story of the two soldiers that were both comparing their wives in a bar in
Yes,
Australia.
yes. And they happen to show the same picture.
We have a story. I see by your favor that you have a lady. You see by my favor that I have a lady too. We see by our favors we have the same lady.
Yeah, yes. That is the allotment anything. But the thing that I didn't truly understand at first was that some of these women didn't do it. They got wrangled into it, much like young girls are wrangled into prostitution, that they would be forced into it. And there was no way out. And they didn't get the money. Other people, like a pimp, would get the money. I don't want to be horribly hard. I mean, it's a terrible thing to do. But back then, women didn't have a lot of options. And a lot of women came off the farms and from, middle America, they didn't have a lot of skills. They were working. My mother at 18 went to work at Maryland Dry Dock as an 18-year-old. Women didn't have a lot of opportunities. And I think some of them sensed when the war ended, they would have nothing. So they were young and naive. They were away from home for the first time. And I think they were easy prey for people that wanted to use them as well. Did they all do that? Probably not. And in fact, there was a film noir movie called Allotment Annie's, I think. And it was about a woman who ran a stable of young ladies who were taking advantage of soldiers and sailors, and about policemen who was trying to catch her. So that was actually a movie. So the military knew this was happening. But, men are young and going off to war and they're afraid, and somebody says they love them. And so this happened a lot.
I can only believe it. And at the same time, I'm like, is it good? Is it bad? Or is it just a thing in its own way?
Well, it's so easy to say who's the villain, but do we really know who the villain is? I don't know.
Yeah.
What would you do if you're desperate?
I blame society that we don't have universal basic income and universal health care. And that's my socialist rant for the week. So.
Okay.
No, it's not.
Do you have any advice? Okay, I have other rants. It's true. Do you have any other advice you'd give to people that are just starting out, just getting their first novel down? What would you say?
Oh, absolutely. Never, ever quit your day job. Because it breaks my heart when I hear people say, well, I'm going to quit and become a writer. I said, please don't do that. Please don't. Because with the advent of Amazon, that was a lovely idea that everyone should be able to get books cheaply. It was a lovely idea, but it has destroyed the ability for most authors to have an income. Unless you're a James Patterson or a J.K. Rowling, everybody else is not making money. I am so fortunate to have a teacher pension and Social Security.
Yeah.
I write because I love to write. I enjoy it. And if you don't enjoy it, don't do it, because you're probably not going to make a living at it. You make more of a living being a reporter, probably. And the other thing is, if you want to be a writer, you better have a thick skin, because you will get rejected constantly. My last book, I have another book I sent out, one of the ones in a drawer. It was rejected 83 times. In fact, Your Forgotten Sons,
in its own way.
Yeah, Your Forgotten Sons was rejected about 90 times.
Wow.
Nobody wanted to publish it. And here's where I'm so glad that I was a referee, where everybody hated me every day, where I had to have police escorts to my car on occasion, and I had my tire knifed, and people said horrible things about me. That got me ready to be an author. Because you can't really hurt my feelings. So when these people are like, oh, I'm afraid to send out my first book. What if no one likes it? People don't like it. Write another one. Write a better one. But they don't want to do that. You can't be sensitive and do this. It is a brutal business. I've been very fortunate. Your Forgotten Sons has gotten very good reviews, but there are a couple people that hate it. I've had 5-star reviews on books and people that said, this is so awful, I can't finish it.
Then I want to encourage everybody out there to, even if you hate the book, any book that you just read, go out to Amazon, put it 1 star, and say why you hated it.
Yes. Yeah. It is so hard to get people to review books, and I love it, hate it. Please review it.
I think that's important, because at the very least, I have gone out and looked at it saying, I don't know if I want to buy this book or not. I literally look at both the 5-star reviews and the 1-star reviews, because some of the 1-star reviews, there were people that came out vitriolic against a book, and I'm like, the reasons that they had that they didn't like it crystallized my desire to buy it and read it as quickly as possible.
I know, you remind me of a review I had recently for Your Forgotten Sons, and a woman gave me 2 stars because I used the word desiccated 3 times in the book.
Desiccated.
What? Desiccated
That's
was a
beautiful.
problem?
She said the first time she read the word, she was enthralled. But after I used it the third time, then that was too much. So I dropped her to 2 stars. I'm like, wow, really?
That's
Was it?
okay.
Wow.
The sound you hear is of palms hitting faces. What?
I don't know. Things were desiccated.
I will, send me a link to that review because I will add it to the fascinating things we've discussed during this episode on our website.
Yeah, I think it's on Amazon.
www.writersdrinkingcoffee.com. And thank you so much. And please, I desperately need that review so that we can say, and here's the desiccated review.
From the person who
I will find it.
Moist.
From the person who likes things moist.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you so much for taking the time, and congratulations. I really do think this book, Your Forgotten Sons, there are people that need to know about the other side of war, and this is a beautiful, painful,
very well written, good, excellent story dealing with.
I read fast, and I read this all in a night. It was that good.
And then you slept? Oh my God.
Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate that immensely, and thank you for inviting me on your show.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time with us today.
Okay, thanks.
Out there, you've been listening to Writers Drinking Coffee, a labor of love and enthusiasm put together by the hosts. Our main web magic is cast by Deirdre Schween, and our sound engineer and backup web spiders are David Welsh, John Schmidt, and Ksenia Chernievskia. Our intro and exit music is performed by Michael Engberg, who's down under in Hervey Bay running Tin Can Music School. Our podcast sponsors are Jackal Designs, Bean Scene Coffee House, Arm Street, and wherever you like to take your laptop to write. And hey, thanks for listening.